If somebody asked you right now, what's the scariest movie you've ever seen, what would your answer be? Most of you would probably say like a Freddy movie, maybe Child's Play or Nightmare on Elm Street. But for me, ever since I was a kid, I've never really been into horror movies. Goblins, ghouls, and ghosts never frightened me because I always knew they weren't real. So the two scariest movies I've ever seen in my life were not horror films. Those movies are The Truman Show and The Manchurian Candidate, the Denzel Washington one from 2004. Both of these films explore the possibility of people being lied to and manipulated to such a degree that their whole realities are exposed as being totally false. What they see and feel, what they hear and what they think are completely fabricated by people they can't see, people they don't even know exist. The mere hint of this being possible scares the hell out of me. What if what I think and feel aren't really what I want to think and feel? What if my entire personality and thoughts were simply the result of forces unseen, very meticulously manipulating the world around me in order to get me to behave in a very specific way? Now, obviously, The Truman Show and The Manchurian Candidate are just works of fiction. They're Hollywood creations designed to thrill us through the big screen. But the idea of brainwashing a person in order to get them to think and behave a certain way is a very real concept that has been explored by various scientists, psychologists, and even governments since at least the 1950s. That's because the world was a very weird place after the Second World War. America and the rest of the free world were determined to halt the spread of communism by any means necessary. Maybe this desire to win led them down dark paths that they shouldn't have gone down. What's up, YouTube? I'm a stone-faced ape. Thank you so much for joining me today. We have a lot to talk about. Please like, please comment, please subscribe. It means so much to me anytime someone tells me they dig my comment, and it helps to grow the channel. But enough all that, let's explore the dark, secretive, and morally questionable tale of the Korean War, the brainwashing scare it created, and the American government's journey into the depths of the human mind. Everything you're about to hear is 100% true. Prisoners of war are, unfortunately, a natural part of most armed conflicts. Soldiers are captured by the enemy, and then the enemy attempts to use those prisoners as leverage. Either they interrogate the captured soldiers to gain information, or they attempt to use the POWs as bargaining chips to get their own POWs back. So it should come as no surprise that when America went to Korea in the summer of 1950 to fight the communist North Koreans, some American soldiers ended up being captured by the North Korean army. It's just a normal part of war.
In Korea, United Nations troops push on in the cautious advance against the communists. With the enemy falling back to the Han River, United Nations commanders had expected that the Reds would make their stand there.
What isn't at all normal is what would transpire next. In July of 1952, Air Force Chief of Staff Frank Schwabel and his co-pilot were reported missing after a combat mission in North Korea. 7 months later, on February 23, 1953, China broadcasted that the captured Frank Schwabel and his co-pilot both confessed that America was engaging in germ warfare against the North Koreans. America immediately denied these accusations, but why would Frank Schwabel, who was a decorated pilot that fought against the Japanese in World War II, make these allegedly false statements against his own country? United Nations Commander General Mark Clark stated, quote, "Whether these statements ever passed the lips of these unfortunate men is doubtful. If they did, however, too familiar are the mind-annihilating methods of these communists in extorting whatever words they want." End quote. What's even more interesting is that Frank Schwabel and his co-pilot weren't the only American POWs to begin behaving strangely while being held captive by the North Koreans and Chinese. 35 additional Air Force POWs made public statements also claiming America had engaged in germ warfare, and other POWs made anti-war statements against the U.S. and U.S. Senator Joseph McCarthy, who was famous for instigating America's hatred for communism. And things only get more bizarre from here. After America and North Korea negotiated a ceasefire via the Korean Armistice Agreement in July of 1953, 21 American POWs refused to return to America and instead chose to remain in China where they were being held. If America was so great and communism was so evil, why would all of these American prisoners of war choose to remain with their communist captors? Well, CIA Director Alan Dulles claimed that the communists were engaging in brain warfare. Director Dulles stated, quote, "The target of this warfare is the minds of men both on a collective and on an individual basis. Its aim is to condition the mind so that it no longer reacts on a free will or rational basis, but responds to impulses implanted from outside. If we are to counter this kind of warfare, we must understand the techniques the Soviet is adopting to control men's minds." End quote. The idea that the communists were in possession of techniques that could control a person against their will carries very serious and very scary implications. These implications immediately whipped America not only into paranoia, but also fascination. Following the Korean War POW situation, various media began to depict and discuss what would soon be called brainwashing. The term brainwashing was originally coined by a journalist named Edward Hunter, who first used the term in a 1950 article for the Miami News. In that article, Edward Hunter made claims that the Chinese and Soviets had developed techniques to control the human mind. This was 3 years before those American POWs made bizarre statements against their own country. At the time the article was written in 1950, Hunter's words were completely disregarded by the average American. After the Korean War POW situation, however, brainwashing would quickly become a household term and a popular topic to discuss in media. Novels like William White's 1956 book, The Organization Man, questions if we are not all the victims of brainwashing at the hands of our employers who seem to demand control not only over our labor, but our minds as well. As you all are very well aware of, employers attempt to manipulate us by telling us that our bosses and coworkers are our families, and it's very clear that most employers desire that we put the needs of the company before our own needs or the needs of our actual families. William White suggests that this could be a form of domestic brainwashing, and I tend to agree. In 1957, Vance Packard writes Hidden Persuaders, where he suggests that the advertisements we see every day are really just a form of brainwashing as well. And if we look at what advertisements have become today, with corporations using our online data and other analytics to present custom advertisements to us, it's hard to argue that Vance Packard was wrong. The 1959 novel The Manchurian Candidate by Richard Condon presents a story that was clearly inspired by the real-life events that took place during the Korean War. In Condon's book, an American platoon in North Korea is captured by elite Soviet commandos and then brainwashed. The commander of that American platoon is then turned into a sleeper agent who is being secretly controlled and made to commit political assassinations against his will. But the most impactful written work about the concept of brainwashing was the 1957 book Battle for the Mind, written by British psychiatrist William Sargant. In this book, Sargant theorizes that situations that cause extreme nervous excitement could result in a person being reconditioned and brainwashed into saying and doing things they normally wouldn't say or do. Sargant presents real-world examples of this, such as police interrogations, the effect Russian mystic Grigory Rasputin had on the people he encountered, and the way girls behaved at the Beatles concerts. Battle for the Mind was an instant success and sold over 200,000 copies in just 10 years and made William Sargant a celebrity. And let me tell you, this was not a good thing because Sargant was an outspoken proponent for electroshock therapy and the use of intravenous drugs such as barbiturates to get his patients to relive and recall repressed traumatic experiences. He believed these methods could be used to brainwash patients into overcoming their trauma. As I'm sure you all know, when a person becomes famous and successful, this causes other people to mimic the famous person's ideas and behaviors. No matter how wild and bizarre your opinions are, if you're rich and famous, people will believe that you're right in everything you say and do. I mean, Kanye West still has fans to this day. This is certainly true in this scenario, but it wasn't just the average citizen who believed Sargon's theories on brainwashing, because the government began to believe these theories as well. After CIA Director Alan Dulles and United Nations Commander General Mark Clark accused the Chinese and Soviets of engaging in brainwashing, America set about determining if the communists were actually capable of such psychological manipulation. Director Alan Dulles and the CIA recruited various American and British psychologists to investigate exactly what the communists had been doing to capture American soldiers. After investigating, most of these psychologists determined that the communists weren't capable of actually controlling a person's mind. They were just engaging in the same old interrogation and torture tactics that countless governments had engaged in for decades, if not centuries. In fact, most psychologists and other academics disliked the term brainwashing altogether. They felt this word sensationalized and dramatized the reality of what those POWs experienced during the Korean War. The term brainwashing paints a picture that the words and actions of those POWs were not really their own, as if they were like robots without autonomy being controlled by the communists. In reality, the American POWs did what they had to in order to survive their captivity. It's only natural for a human to say or do anything in order to survive. Part of the reason so many people were willing to believe that the communists had taken control of those captured soldiers' minds is because at the time, the Korean War vets were viewed as weak-willed and more sensitive compared to the previous generations of American soldiers. And that probably sounds pretty familiar to you. Society has a tendency to label newer generations inferior compared to past generations. It's been going on forever. The Korean War POW situation raised questions about the social fabric of America and whether the dissatisfaction of the younger generation played a part in some of those soldiers making statements against America and even choosing to remain in China with the communists. For example, at least 3 of those soldiers who chose to stay in China were African American. Keep in mind, this is the 1950s, about a decade before the Civil Rights Movement. Now, why would a black soldier choose to return to America where they are guaranteed to be treated as second-class citizens? The idea that the communists were simply brainwashing soldiers into saying and doing things they really didn't want to completely ignores all of the potential social issues that could have led to those soldiers choosing to say and do those things. And this is why many psychologists did not like the term brainwashing at the time. Despite the fact that psychologists didn't like the term brainwashing, the American government encouraged this term because it helped to paint the communists as the ultimate boogeyman. Like I mentioned earlier, CIA Director Alan Dulles stated that it was imperative for America to understand these brainwashing techniques that the Soviets were using, despite the fact that all evidence pointed towards there not being any secret brainwashing techniques. This is because America was already knee-deep in their own brainwashing research and experiments quite a while before the Korean War POW situation occurred. The idea of developing methods to control a man's mind has its origins in the quest for a truth serum. A truth serum being some sort of substance that would render a man incapable of telling a lie. The Nazis were the first to use mind-altering substances on human test subjects in experiments that were designed to discover a truth serum. In concentration camps such as Dachau and Auschwitz, Nazi scientists administered barbiturates, morphine, and hallucinogenic drugs like mescaline on unwilling prisoners during their twisted and depraved experiments. Some historians believe that the CIA was inspired by the Nazis, and this is why the American government would go on to use narcotics in their own experiments. In the fall of 1947, the U.S. Navy began Project Chatter, where drugs were used in the course of interrogations. The point of this project was to determine which drugs would be helpful in getting information from a person being interrogated. This project included experiments on both animals and humans, and drugs such as scopolamine and mescaline were used. This project also marks the first time that the American government tested the use of LSD or acid on humans, but it certainly would not be the last time America would utilize LSD. In either 1949 or 1950, the CIA began Project Bluebird. This project was initiated to investigate the whispers that the Soviets had developed methods to control a person's mind and to develop countermeasures if these rumors turned out to be true. The Army, Air Force, and Navy also participated in this project, but the FBI, for whatever reason, declined to participate, which I think is interesting. Of all of these organizations, like the military and the FBI, it's the FBI who was like, nah, using drugs on Americans, that's too far for us. Project Bluebird focused mainly on returning Korean War POWs who were placed in Army hospitals such as Valley Forge Hospital in Pennsylvania and the Walter Reed facility in Washington, D.C. At these facilities, CIA operated interrogation teams, which consisted of a psychiatrist, a polygraphed hypnotist, and a technician, performed what they called behavioral modification programs on these Korean War vets. These programs consisted of advanced interrogation methods, hypnosis, and the use of various drugs such as LSD, mescaline, and peyote. The CIA even worked with scientists to synthesize their own drug that was sometimes referred to as smasher. This was an LSD-like drug that contained amphetamines and other enhancers. Experiments were also performed outside of the US at CIA-operated black sites in Germany and Japan. The human test subjects were often not aware that they were being experimented on either. An infamous situation that is sometimes attributed to the CIA and Project Bluebird occurred on August 15, 1951 in Pont-Saint-Esprit, France. I hope I pronounced that right. It was here that more than 250 people experienced some kind of poisoning. The official story is that bread made from flour that had been infected with a fungus called ergot was distributed to many residents in this town in France. This caused a mass outbreak of ergotism, where individuals experienced food poisoning-like symptoms, but also hallucinations. One man hallucinated that he was in an airplane, and he by jumping from a second-story window. And an 11-year-old boy who was hallucinating attempted to strangle his own mother. Ultimately, 7 people died from this incident. Now, the reason some people claim this was a CIA experiment is because, for one, the American government is guilty of experimenting on the unsuspecting public, like in Operation Sea Spray, which occurred just 1 year prior in 1950. This operation saw the Navy spray infectious bacteria over San Francisco to determine how effective anthrax would be if utilized in war. And many San Franciscans did get sick from this bacteria that the Navy sprayed. I'll be speaking a lot more on Operation Sea Spray, in particular one guy named Frank Olson who plays a very major part of this story, but I'll get to that later. Another major reason some people point to the CIA being involved in this tragedy in France is because LSD is derived from the ergot fungus, the same fungus that is blamed for causing the illness and hallucinations in France. The CIA was heavily involved in experimenting with LSD at this time. There's a lot of smoke and guns or circumstantial evidence that points towards this being some kind of CIA operation, but we'll probably never know the truth if the American government was actually behind this incident, and I will be pointing out some other tidbits that points to the CIA being involved in this incident at Pont-Saint-Esprit, France. Shortly after the ergot poisoning incident in France, Project Bluebird was succeeded by Project Artichoke on August 20th, 1951. The name is said to have come from a New York gangster named Ciro Terranova, who was called the Artichoke King after buying all of the artichokes coming into New York and then selling them for 3 times the typical price. Now, I don't know why the CIA chose this random New York gangster to name their secret CIA operation, but that's the story. Project Artichoke had several goals, but the main objectives were to determine if it were possible to brainwash foreign nationals to then send them back to Europe to operate as double agents, and also to see if it were possible for a person to be programmed to unknowingly carry out assassinations. A 1952 CIA memo poses the question, quote, "Can we get control of an individual to the point where he will do our bidding against his will and even against fundamental laws of nature such as self-preservation?" End quote. The Cold War was all about both offense and defense, determining what the communists were capable of doing and also determining if America could outdo them in the same game. One document from the CIA concerning Project Artichoke very clearly expresses this desire. Quote, "The problem exists of ascertaining whether effective and practical techniques exist or could be developed, which could be utilized to render an individual subservient to an imposed will or control, thereby posing a potential threat to national security." End quote. That same document also states, quote, "We need to also explore the subtle means of making an individual say or do things he would normally not consider through the use of covertly administered drugs, black psychiatry, hypnosis, and brain-damaging processes." End quote. While some psychologists view the use of the term brainwashing as sensationalized propaganda designed to make the average American citizen afraid of communism, it's quite clear that the American government legitimately feared the possibilities of the Soviets being able to control a person's mind. Project Artichoke was led by the CIA's Security Research Branch, and the Security Research Branch was headed by Paul F. Gaynor, who was the living embodiment of toxic masculinity. Gaynor was most famous for maintaining an extensive file on all federal employees who were known or suspected homosexuals. These files were so notorious that one State Department employee unalived himself after discovering he had been added to these files. A Democratic senator later did the same after Republicans attempted to blackmail him with information about his son, information those Republicans got from Gaynor's gay files. And that's just me putting a PC term on it. That's not what they call those files. They were referred to as F files. You know, the F word that rhymes with bag. These files weren't some secret document either. Federal employees regularly referred to these files anytime they were conducting a background check on anyone. The 1950s were very different from today. And that's just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to how scummy of an individual Paul Gaynor was, because he was also known to be a pro-Nazi and to associate with other federal employees who were also pro-Nazi. Yes, there were multiple federal employees who sympathized with the Nazis in the 1950s. That's insane. This is the guy who had a leading role in Project Artichoke, a project that was designed to drug, interrogate, hypnotize, and torture people. Gaynor is quoted as saying, quote, "All individuals can be broken under mental and physical assaults, and by such techniques as denying sleep, exhaustion, persuasion, starvation, pain, humiliation, and sickness." End quote. Having been introduced to one of the major players of Project Artichoke, you'll likely not be surprised at how dark, depraved, and depressing Project Artichoke would become. And just as a callback to the 1951 ergot poisoning incident in France, Paul Gaynor explicitly mentions the special use of ergots at a 1954 Project Artichoke conference, stating, quote, "We need to teach the artichoke techniques to medical officers in the field. We also need to combine these techniques with the work carried on at Edgewood Arsenal and at Camp Detrick, and the special use of ergots as well as lysergic acid." End quote. Not such a far-fetched conspiracy that the CIA was behind that incident in France, is it? Another leading figure in Project Artichoke was Naval Intelligence Officer Morse Allen. This is a man who was ambitious and enthusiastic in all the wrong ways and for all the wrong reasons. Since the purpose of Project Artichoke was to perform experiments on humans to decode the possibilities of brainwashing, the CIA was in need of a steady supply of human test subjects. Morse Allen was more than willing to come up with solutions for this problem. In 1952, Allen sent a memo to Paul Gaynor proposing that they use American military men who had been court-martialed and were serving time in federal institutions. Allen suggested that they tell these court-martialed soldiers that their sentences would be reduced if they voluntarily participated in Project Artichoke experiments. Morse Allen also suggested that the CIA use federal prisons that had a hospital wing as a location for these experiments, since the federal prisons weren't as overcrowded as state prisons. Now, Allen later amended this proposal because he realized how evil it would be to perform their experiments on American soldiers. I'm completely bullshitting. He actually amended his proposal to include all federal hospitals and any institution that was under the control of the U.S. Public Health Service. So not only did Morse Allen want to perform experiments on soldiers who had broken the law, but also on any person who was in any federal institution for any reason. Yikes. Paul Gaynor, being the wonderful person that he was, approved of Morse Allen's proposals, and so experiments commenced at 3 federal prisons, a reformatory in New Jersey, St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, D.C., a VA hospital in Detroit, and at the Federal Narcotics Farm in Lexington, Kentucky. They were doing experiments on veterans at the VA hospital. That's shameful. The experiments performed at the Federal Narcotics Farm explicitly targeted black inmates, since many at the CIA believed them to be inferior to the white inmates, and therefore their lives and health held much less value. Shortly after these experiments began, the U.S. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare was created in March of 1953. Believe me, despite its name, this department would go on to deprive many people of their health and welfare when they allowed the CIA to use federal medical facilities to perform experiments on unwilling human subjects. Unsurprisingly, most of these test subjects were African Americans or members of immigrant groups, with one CIA document referring to them as lower classes. On top of your typical CIA drugs and torture experiments, Project Artichoke also explored the possibility of hypnosis. In March of 1952, the Security Research Branch and the Scientific Intelligence Branch of the CIA decided to pursue hypnotism with the hopes that eventually, quote, 200 trained CIA operators trained in the United States could develop and command a unique, dangerous army of hypnotically controlled agents. You cannot make this stuff up. In 1954, Gaynor sent a memo to the Technical Services Division proposing a new artichoke operation be implemented within American borders, despite the fact that most politicians in D.C. did not believe that the CIA was legally allowed to conduct domestic operations. And spoiler alert, they weren't. They were absolutely not allowed to do this in America. This operation would be designed to capture illegal immigrants, branding them as undesirable aliens, and then having them removed from the country. This was so the CIA could use the possibility of legal re-entry as a means of convincing these illegal immigrants to participate in the CIA's experiments. These experiments would attempt to turn those captured illegal immigrants into double agents that the CIA would then send into foreign countries to engage in various acts of espionage on behalf of the CIA. Gaynor planned on making contact with these illegal immigrants by setting up, quote, sympathetic fake left-wing organizations that would have secretly been created by the CIA. Gaynor states in the memo that the best way of identifying which illegal immigrants to use would be, quote, selection, screening, indoctrination, and ultimately hypnosis, end quote. And I just want to point out that quite a few of the elements Gaynor uses to describe this plan involving illegal immigrants are fairly reminiscent to what we're seeing today in regards to immigration and deportations and stuff. I think it would be pretty interesting if the CIA was using ICE to create an army of hypnotically controlled immigrant spies. Now, I'm not saying that's what they're doing. I'm just saying that'd be interesting if that's what the plan was all along. Now, you may be thinking that even though all of this looks flat out abhorrent, surely the CIA must have thought that at the time, what they were doing would easily and clearly be recognized as in the best interest of national security. Well, no, because one note recovered from a 1954 Artichoke meeting states, quote, Morse Allen and Paul Gaynor emphasized the fact that this type of work must not be overburdened in a maze of statistics, technical reports, and learned academic experimentation, since previous experiences along these lines clearly indicate that when this appears, the end results are almost always negative, end quote. In other words, Gaynor and Allen knew that if they approached these experiments as any academic scientist or psychologist would, the end results would appear as exactly what it was, which is torture for the sake of torture with no meaningful or positive results. They knew that the only way to make their experiments look like a success would be to force it to appear that way. It would be like if you created new math with your own special rules that allowed 1 + 1 to = 3. They were trying to juke the stats. They also were able to juke excessive media attention because not a whole lot is known about Project Artichoke, other than the few tidbits I was able to dig up for this video. Now, there's definitely not as much information about Project Artichoke as there is about the CIA's next foray into brainwashing, which is, of course, MK Ultra. All right, here we go. In 1953, the CIA gave the green light for a new project that was set about decoding the possibilities of brainwashing. The one everyone has heard about, the one that spawned countless conspiracy theories. Of course, I'm talking about Project MK Ultra. There's no doubt that MK Ultra is the most well-known CIA endeavor in history, but there's a sneaky little reason for that cooked up by the White House, but I'll get to that later. MK Ultra was orchestrated by the CIA's Office of Scientific Intelligence in conjunction with the Army's Biological Warfare Laboratories. MK Ultra is most famous for its extensive use of LSD, and I promise you that it really can't be overstated how prominent LSD was in this project. For example, the CIA paid the pharmaceutical company Eli Lilly about $400,000 for LSD that would be used in their MK Ultra experiments. Talk about tax dollars hard at work. MK Ultra was headed and co-founded by a chemist and spy master named Sidney Gottlieb, who held a doctorate in biochemistry, and he also had extensive knowledge in various poisons. It was this knowledge that led CIA Director Alan Dulles to place Dr. Gottlieb at the head of their brainwashing endeavors. I also think it's interesting to point out that Gottlieb was actually a card-carrying socialist while in college because he was a member of the Young People's Socialist League at the University of Wisconsin. I always assumed that if you had anything even remotely close to communism in your background, the CIA would never allow you within its orbit, at least not during the Cold War era. But I guess I was wrong. Prior to his work at the CIA, Gottlieb worked for the Food and Drug Administration, where he helped to develop tests that could detect the presence of drugs in the human body. So he's at least partly to blame for all those drug screens we gotta take for work. So fuck this guy, just for that alone. And I find all of that to be extremely ironic, considering what he would be doing while he was working for the CIA. Gottlieb was first introduced to LSD after he began working for the National Research Council in 1948, where he states he was, quote, exposed to some interesting work concerning ergot alkaloids as hallucinogens, end quote. Once again, we see an individual who performed work for the CIA's brainwashing projects who was well aware of the ergot fungus having hallucinogenic properties. The same ergot that would poison the residents of Pont-Saint-Esprit, France. I just wanted to point that out. In the summer of 1951, Gottlieb was hired by the CIA and was brought on to add some scientific knowledge to the ongoing Project Bluebird. When Bluebird was expanded and turned into Project Artichoke, Gottlieb was given a leading role. Sidney Gottlieb and director Alan Dulles shared the belief that the human mind could be broken and controlled with enough effort, and of course with enough narcotics. Gottlieb's end goal was to discover, quote, techniques that would crush the human psyche to the point that it would admit anything, end quote. At first, Gottlieb experimented with marijuana, cocaine, mescaline, and heroin, but he soon discovered that these drugs mainly just got in the way of interrogations as opposed to dragging the truth out of their test subjects. At some point, Gottlieb tested LSD on himself for the first time, and he quickly became convinced that LSD was the answer to discovering the truth serum and unlocking the secrets to controlling the human mind. Gottlieb accelerated LSD experiments at the CIA and would administer the drug to every agent he could. Some of these agents even agreed to be dosed with LSD by surprise. However, Gottlieb didn't stop there because he would frequently dose federal employees with LSD even if they had never consented to be a part of his experiments. But much more on that later. In order to truly understand the power held within LSD, Gottlieb felt that a new project needed to be created, one that zeroed in on LSD as opposed to other substances. He sent a memo to Director Doles in 1953, and Doles approved this proposed project on April 13th. This project would be codenamed MK Ultra. It's important to note before I go any further that MK Ultra was the overarching project that set about exploring the possibilities of LSD and brainwashing, but MK Ultra was made up of many different sub-projects that each had their own specific objectives. I want to go over just two of these sub-projects, starting with the one I found the most interesting and the one you'll probably find most interesting as well, Sub-Project 35, also known as Operation Midnight Climax. Operation Midnight Climax was created in 1954 by none other than the CIA's resident psychonaut Sidney Gottlieb. The operation was based out of San Francisco and was placed under the supervision of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, primarily a narcotics agent named George Hunter White. Now, George Hunter White is a very interesting figure in and of himself. You can do some research on him if you want. His story is absolutely wild as well. Agent White would enlist prostitutes to lure customers to CIA safe houses around San Francisco. The ladies of the night would then give their Johns a range of narcotics to use, including LSD. The purpose of these experiments was to better understand the effects LSD had on non-consenting test subjects. The prostitutes were instructed by their CIA handlers to ask their drugged-up customers a variety of questions after they had sex in order to determine if the test subjects could be convinced to involuntarily reveal secrets. Mind you, the prostitutes and the drugged customers were not alone in these safe houses. CIA agents monitored the entire interaction, including the sex part, from behind a one-way glass mirror. The prostitutes were even instructed to feed their clients subliminal messages in an attempt to see if the intoxicated customers could be convinced to commit criminal acts such as robbery, assault, and even assassinations. I am not making this stuff up. Look it up for yourself if you don't believe me. It should go without saying that this sub-project raised a lot of questions concerning ethics and legality. Unlike Project Bluebird and Artichoke, this sub-project allowed Sidney Gottlieb to experiment on unconsenting civilians as opposed to soldiers and other federal employees. In 1947, President Truman had prohibited the CIA from spying on American citizens, and this project was in direct violation of that order, which would mean that when everything the CIA did during Operation Midnight Climax was totally illegal. Unsurprisingly, all of this was ignored due to the CIA claiming these experiments were in the name of national security, of course. Midnight Climax was an extremely secretive project that even most high-ranking government officials knew nothing about it, allegedly. The overall findings of this sub-project have never been revealed publicly, but one military intelligence officer named Ike Feldman remarked that he noticed the subject spoke far more freely when under the influence of a combination of drugs and sex. And I mean, like, no shit, Ike. I don't think you needed some secret CIA experiment to come to that conclusion. It's also been reported that CIA agents would regularly use the LSD and prostitutes that this sub-project made available for their own personal use. Since these experiments and others like it exposed the citizens of San Francisco to hallucinogenic substances, some analysts believe that the CIA played a direct role in creating the counterculture psychedelic-centered movement that would come about in the 1960s in that Haight-Ashbury district in San Francisco. And that is the epitome of irony. By design, LSD was the focal point of MK Ultra, but the CIA was also interested in other avenues that could potentially lead to brainwashing. One of those avenues was something called sensory deprivation. In June of 1951, several high-ranking members of the CIA, the British Defense, the Canadian Defense Research Board, and one neuropsychologist met at a hotel in Montreal to discuss the reports concerning Soviet interrogation techniques. Ultimately, this meeting would lead to the creation of Project Artichoke, but it also led to the concept of sensory deprivation. The neuropsychologist who was at this meeting was a man named Donald Hebb, and he suggested that if you removed all sensory stimulation from a person, that would cause this person to become mentally vulnerable enough that you could implant new ideas into their mind and control them, aka brainwashing. Donald Hebb was given a grant by the Canadian Defense Research Board and would go on to conduct his own experiments, but it was through Donald Hebb that the CIA became aware of his colleague, Donald Cameron. Cameron was a Canadian psychiatrist who had been conducting his own experiments to find the cure for schizophrenia. And by experiments, I really just mean various forms of torture. In the 1930s, Cameron performed experiments like dehydrating epileptic patients in order to see if the dehydration would cause more seizures. Because science, I guess. He also had an experiment where he would place schizophrenic patients in a 107-degree Fahrenheit room for an hour to observe what effects extreme temperatures would have on them. Now, Nazi scientists performed very similar experiments on concentration camp prisoners. The reason I bring that up is because Donald Cameron was actually one of the psychiatrists present at the Nuremberg trials and was tasked with evaluating whether or not the accused Nazi Rudolf Hess was mentally stable enough to stand trial. It was Cameron's opinion that the experiments performed by the Nazi scientists were horrific, and yet Cameron would go on to perform his own abhorrent experiments on mentally ill patients. It really just goes to show you that the average person, regardless of how educated they are, is rarely capable of holding themselves to the same level of scrutiny that they easily hold others to. Donald Cameron published his experiments in academic journals, and yet this did not deter the CIA from contracting him to perform their MKUltra experiments. If anything, it made him more attractive to the CIA. Sometime during the late 1950s, the CIA contacted Cameron through a front organization called the Society for the Investigation for Human Ecology. In January of 1957, they began funding Cameron through this organization in order for Cameron to perform experiments on their behalf. Internally, the CIA referred to Cameron's experiments as Subproject 68, but it's very plausible that Cameron had no idea that the work he was performing was actually for the CIA. This isn't uncommon either, because the CIA contracted a vast number of their experiments to various institutions including Tulane, Harvard, and Columbia University. It's actually said that the CIA funded over 150 different institutions to carry out their MKUltra experiments. These contracted institutions included universities, prisons, hospitals, and pharmaceutical companies. While it's no doubt that most of the scientists and psychologists who performed these experiments had no clue they were being funded by the CIA, it's believed that many top officials at these institutions were well aware where the money was coming from. Donald Cameron had developed the methods of psychic driving and de-patterning shortly before he began working for the CIA, and he would use these concepts throughout the duration of Subproject 68. Psychic driving was a method where Cameron would repeatedly play recordings of triggering phrases to his patients in an attempt to bring their repressed memories to the forefront. He would often use drugs like sodium amylbarbital to place the patients into a clinical coma, and he would then play the recordings of these triggering phrases for 15 days straight, up to 20 hours a day. Talk about a fucking nightmare. He would also sometimes administer LSD to his patients during these sessions. Cameron claimed the purpose of these sessions was to help his patients, but usually it would result in what he called mental de-patterning, which would cause the patients to enter a state of mental distress, dysfunction, and high anxiety. But this was also by design, according to Cameron, because having his patients in this sort of mental state would allow him to rebuild the mental structure of his patients however he chose. This could very easily be defined as brainwashing, and this work is what attracted the CIA to Donald Cameron in the first place. Another method Cameron used to achieve de-patterning was to administer chlorpromazine and other barbiturates to place patients in a coma-like state where they slept for 22 hours a day. Cameron would leave them in this state for up to 10 days straight. Afterwards, Cameron would use electroshock treatment on the patients and this would result in the desired depatterning after 3 stages. The first stage patients would go through during this ordeal would be short-term memory loss. The patients would remember where they were and who the people around them were, but not much else. The second stage was a more severe memory loss where the patients would remember where they were or why they were there, and they would also begin to lose some basic motor skills as well as the ability to hold their bladder. The final stage saw patients lose all sense of who they were, a complete loss of self-identity. In Cameron's mind, this left the patients in a completely blank state and ready for reprogramming, kind of like a factory reset. Donald Cameron would claim that these sessions would result in the patients having fewer manic episodes afterwards, but the drug he used, chlorpromazine, was already being recognized as an effective way to treat manic depression, and its effectiveness began being published in several academic journals at least 3 years prior to Cameron's experiments, so there's no way he didn't already know about this. In other words, it was the chlorpromazine that was curing his patients, not the electroshock therapy and the rest of his torturous methods. But Cameron didn't see it that way. In his words, quote, "Recovery consists not in repair of damaged aspects of the individual's personality, but in rearrangement," end quote. And I have to be honest, man, this screams of a God complex. Cameron felt that his mentally ill patients were completely dysfunctional and worthless from top to bottom, and that it was only through his total reprogramming and reshaping of their entire identities could they finally be considered cured. And that's absolutely monstrous. As you could imagine, the friends and families of Donald Cameron's patients were not pleased with the state their loved ones were in once they returned home. Many of their loved ones claimed they weren't the same people anymore after having been treated by Cameron. The daughter of one of Cameron's patients said her father was a loving and attentive dad before he was treated by Cameron. Afterwards, she said he had become emotionally distant, irritable, and even abusive. Cameron turned his patients from loving family members who suffered from mental illness to abusive, angry family members who suffered from even more mental illness. In the decades following these experiments, multiple lawsuits were filed against the institutions that hosted Cameron's experiments. But what about the CIA and the American government? What penalty would they face once the world would become aware of all the horrendous actions they perpetrated against American citizens? Well, you're about to be disappointed. In the spring of 1974, New York Times journalist Seymour Hersh would be given the alley-oop of a lifetime, the scoop to end all scoops. An unidentified member of the CIA tipped Hersh off to, everything the CIA had been doing to American citizens throughout the 1950s and 60s. On December 22, 1974, Seymour Hersh would turn this explosive information into an even more explosive New York Times article that would end up blowing the lid off all the illegal spying the CIA had been conducting on American citizens. This article exposed several secret CIA operations that included the opening of mail, break-ins, and wiretapping of American citizens. Many of this illegal surveillance was against members of the anti-war movement of the 60s. With extensive help from the National Security Agency, or the NSA, the CIA and FBI were able to intercept international communications by members of far-left movements. The NSA gave this information to the FBI and CIA under the conditions that they destroy or return all of these reports within 2 weeks of receiving them. This was because the CIA was well aware that what they were engaged in was highly illegal and in direct violation of the Communications Act of 1934. This act is supposed to safeguard all of us from having our communications interfered with by the government. As American citizens, our government is not supposed to violate our privacy and spy on us. Now, this video is not about most of the things exposed by Seymour Hersh in his article. You can do your own research if you're interested, or maybe I'll make a video on it in the future. What's relevant to this video is the governmental response to Seymour Hersh's article. CIA official Cord Meyer believed that this article, quote, convinced large sections of the American public that the CIA had become a domestic Gestapo, end quote. On January 4th, 1975, in an attempt to win back the hearts and minds of the American public, Republican President Gerald Ford ordained the United States President's Commission on CIA Activities within the United States, or the Rockefeller Commission, which was named after Vice President Nelson Rockefeller, who led this commission. The purpose of the commission is right in the name, to investigate what the CIA have been doing in America over the last 20-ish years. Future Vice President Dick Cheney, who actually passed away while I was doing research for this video, had been the one to encourage President Ford to create this commission with 4 goals in mind: to examine the charges made against the CIA by that New York Times article, to avoid being tarnished by controversy, to install safeguards of intelligence, whatever that means, and to ensure that the CIA's ability to operate was not inhibited. At the time, Dick Cheney was the Deputy Chief of Staff. Additionally, it's worth mentioning that Ronald Reagan was also a part of this commission. The Rockefeller Commission revealed many things to the American public. Some of these revelations include the fact that the CIA had performed experiments on unwitting American citizens, Canadian and Danish citizens, and detainees that had been held in CIA black sites. The commission also revealed the CIA's use of LSD, electroshock treatments, sensory deprivation, etc., in an attempt to unlock the secrets of brainwashing. While all of this sounds noble and honorable, the fact that the Rockefeller Commission was revealing this information to the American public, in reality, this situation was kind of like when you ask the police to investigate the police. There's bound to be some cover-ups, and that's exactly what happened here. The Rockefeller Commission was supposed to be completely independent of presidential interference, but the final report submitted by the commission was heavily edited by the White House staff, including Dick Cheney himself. For example, 86 pages referring to CIA assassination plots were entirely removed from the final report, according to internal White House documents. The White House also attempted to manipulate the public's trust in the government by instructing intelligence agencies to review their secret documents and declassify as much of them as possible. Translation: give the public some old salacious goodies to make them think we're being transparent, but don't give them anything too sensitive. Only give them what's safe and inconsequential. Now, where have we heard this before? A president's administration promising to release some files that would expose sensitive information about the government and the people in it, but then not actually releasing those files or releasing a heavily edited version of those files. Sounds very familiar. Luckily for the American public, the White House-controlled Rockefeller Commission wasn't the only group of government officials seeking to expose the CIA. Around the same time the Rockefeller Commission was pump faking like they were actually trying to be transparent, the Senate created their own group to investigate the CIA called the United States Senate Select Committee to study governmental operations with respect to intelligence activities. Very long name. It's more simply referred to as the Church Committee, which was chaired by Democratic Idaho Senator Frank Church. From the very beginning, the Church Committee faced intense opposition from the White House and the Rockefeller Commission, despite the fact that, on paper, they were both supposed to be doing the same thing, which was expose illegal CIA activity on American soil. Senator Church even stated that the Rockefeller Commission was purposefully withholding CIA documents, and members of the Church Committee later stated that the CIA itself was also responsible for the denial of access they received. Which makes you wonder, if both the Church Committee and the Rockefeller Commission were supposed to be investigating and exposing the CIA, but the CIA only had a problem with the Church Committee getting hold of sensitive documents, then that must mean the Rockefeller Commission was in bed with the CIA all along. And that must mean the Rockefeller Commission never had any plans to legitimately investigate and punish the CIA for their illegal activities on American citizens. Keep in mind, the Rockefeller Commission was the one being controlled by the White House, which means the President of the United States of America, who was duly elected by the American people, chose to protect an agency over the citizens he swore to serve and protect. It's absolutely sad and disgusting. The main reason the CIA and the White House didn't want the Church Committee to get their hands on sensitive documents is because the CIA did not want the family jewels to be exposed to the public. The family jewels were sensitive documents that outlined the CIA's secret program to assassinate various foreign leaders like Fidel Castro, Patrice Lumumba, and Rene Schneider, as well as a host of other illegal shit the CIA had been doing, like breaking into the homes of American citizens and opening their mail. Once the Church Committee was finally able to get their hands on this information, they found the information to be so damning and insidious that they even began investigating the possibility that the CIA was behind the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. The way the Church Committee saw it was, if the CIA was willing to go so far as to violate foreign policy by planning to kill foreign leaders and to violate American laws by spying on citizens, then they probably wouldn't have an issue with killing the leader of their own country as well. President Ford begged the Church Committee not to release the information concerning the CIA assassination programs because he believed that it was cause, quote, grievous harm to the national interest, end quote. The Church Committee voted to reject President Ford's request, and Senator Frank Church personally responded to President Ford saying, quote, in my view, the national interest is better served by letting the American people know the true and complete story. We believe that foreign peoples will, upon sober reflection, admire our nation more for keeping faith with our democratic ideas than they will condemn us for the misconduct itself, end quote. To put it more simply, Senator Church believed both the American people and the international community would have much more respect and admiration for America if they just kept it real and corrected their mistakes, as opposed to trying to lie about it and cover it up. I absolutely agree with Senator Church, and I wish we had politicians like him today to hold our government accountable for their misconduct. Nobody respects a man who constantly lies and denies and refuses to own up to his mistakes. The same should be true for the government. You would think that after Senator Church admonished the president and his administration for their spineless behavior, that they would straighten up and fly right. But you would be wrong. This is politics after all. The final report submitted by the Church Committee exposed the CIA assassination plots as well as Operation Mockingbird, which revealed how the CIA had American and foreign journalists on their payroll who will pump out propaganda pieces to influence American and foreign opinions. The FBI even caught some strays as well because the Church Committee also exposed COINTELPRO, which was the Bureau's operation to dismantle and destroy pro-black movements like the Civil Rights Movement, Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam, and the Black Panther Party. But the one thing that spooked the CIA and President Ford's administration the most was how the Church Committee exposed the insane story of Frank Olson. Frank Olson was a former American captain who then went on to become a bacteriologist and a biological warfare scientist. He helped develop biological weapons for America during World War II. He also worked to develop weaponized anthrax at Camp Detrick alongside ex-Nazi scientists who had been brought into America via Operation Paperclip. After World War II, Olson discharged from the Army but remained at Camp Detrick to continue assisting the American military and the CIA in developing biological weapons. Remember when I was telling you about Operation Sea Spray, where the Navy sprayed infectious bacteria over San Francisco to better understand how anthrax might be used as a weapon? Yeah, Frank Olson was instrumental in that operation. Camp Detrick was a very important hub for both Project Bluebird and Project Artichoke. In fact, Frank Olson was appointed to the Project Artichoke Committee in 1952. Sadly, this would prove to be very unfortunate for Frank Olson. So unfortunate that by 1953, he began to step away from his work with the CIA. Frank's son would later state that his father was deeply troubled by the work he performed for the CIA. Frank had seen animals be gassed, poisoned, and tortured as a part of his research. He had also seen humans be drugged, hypnotized, and tortured to death at CIA safe houses. All of this had a very negative effect on Frank Olson's mental health, as I'm sure it would for most sane people. After the Korean War POW situation, which if you'll remember was where several captured American soldiers made statements accusing America of engaging in biological warfare against the Koreans, Frank had traveled to Europe where he witnessed several CIA interrogations. Keep in mind, Project Bluebird saw the CIA interrogate soldiers who were Korean War POWs, and some of these interrogations took place in Europe. This is probably what Frank Olson was a part of, but it's never been publicly confirmed. When Frank returned home, his friends and family stated that his mood had changed. Frank had become convinced that America did in fact engage in germ warfare against the Koreans during the war. Considering the fact that Frank, who was a bacteriologist for the government, played a big part in developing these biological weapons, this made him feel extremely guilty. I also want to point out that Frank Olson was in France at the same time as the Pont Saint-Esprit ergot poisoning incident I mentioned earlier. Coincidence? I done gave y'all a lot of smoking guns. Y'all let me know in the comments what y'all think. At some point after returning home from Europe, Frank Olson went to visit William Sargant. If you'll remember, Sargant was the guy who wrote Battle for the Mind and became a celebrity behind it. I guess Frank tried to vent to Sargant about how guilty he was feeling, because afterwards, Sargant stated that he believed Frank Olson had become a security threat. Sargant also believed that Frank's access to military facilities should be limited due to the fact that Frank was knee-deep in the brainwashing game, so he knew a whole lot about all of the CIA's drugging, tortures, biological warfare, etc. If Frank ever became so guilt-ridden that he started to believe he needed to expose the CIA's horrific operations to the world, he absolutely could do so. From Wednesday, November 18th to Friday, November 20th in 1953, Sidney Gottlieb, who was the man behind MK and the CIA's heavy involvement with LSD, held an MK retreat at Deep Creek Lake in Maryland. That Thursday, November 19th, Sidney Gottlieb instructed his deputy, named Robert Lashbrook, to put LSD in the liquor that everyone was drinking that night. Remember I was telling you that Gottlieb would dose federal agents with LSD even if they had never consented to be a part of his experiments? Yeah, this is what I was talking about. Frank Olson had consumed this alcohol that, unbeknownst to him, had been spiked with the LSD. And based on all the research I've done for this video, this would have been the first time Frank Olson had ever used LSD. Frank was already at a low point in his life, undoubtedly suffering from severe depression due to the guilt he felt after helping the American government commit a variety of war crimes and other inhumane activity. And now all of a sudden he found himself forced into an acid trip at a work function. I mean, if Frank wasn't already fed up with working for the government, he certainly was now. When Frank returned home from the MK retreat, his family noticed he wasn't acting like himself. He refused to eat, he wasn't attentive to his children like he normally was, and he barely even spoke. Finally, he blurted out to his wife, quote, "I've made a terrible mistake." When his wife asked for him to elaborate, he refused to do so. Frank returned to work at Camp Dietrich that Monday, November 23rd, but he also threatened to quit. His supervisor, Lieutenant Colonel Vincent Rouet, was able to calm him down, but he noticed that Frank seemed extremely agitated and deeply disturbed by his work. The following day, on Tuesday, November 24th, Frank went to work as usual, but he returned home around noon. He wasn't alone either. He had been brought back by one of his co-workers. His wife, who was clearly confused by all of this, asked Frank what was going on. Frank informed his wife that his co-workers at Camp Dietrich had insisted he return home with one of his co-workers because they feared he might harm his wife and children due to the way he had been acting recently. That same day, Frank Olson was convinced by his co-workers that he needed psychiatric help, so he flew with his boss, Lieutenant Colonel Rouet, and some other co-workers to New York to meet with Dr. Harold Abramson. Abramson was linked to the CIA, and he even played a significant role in MK He was also an avid proponent of therapeutic LSD. Just 4 days later, on Saturday, November 28, 1953, Frank Olson plummeted from his New York hotel room window around 2 a.m. He did not survive this fall. The night manager of the hotel witnessed this fall and rushed to Frank's body. The manager stated that Frank was attempting to tell him something before he passed away, but Frank was so injured that the manager couldn't make out what he was trying to say. Years later, the night manager would state, quote, In all my years in the hotel business, I never encountered a case where someone got up in the middle of the night, ran across a dark room in his underwear, avoiding two beds, and dove through a closed window with the shade and curtains drawn. End quote. When the police made it into the hotel room, they found Robert Lashbrook sitting on the toilet in the room he was sharing with Frank Olson. Like I said, Robert Lashbrook was the man who spiked the liquor with LSD at Sidney Gottlieb's MK Ultra retreat. The hotel's switchboard operator stated to have connected a call from the hotel room to a phone number belonging to Dr. Harold Abramson shortly after Frank fell from the window. According to the switchboard operator, the man calling from the hotel room, who was probably Robert Lashbrook, said, "Well, he's gone." And the man answering from Dr. Abramson's number responded, "Well, that's too bad." Also, the two police officers at the crime scene remarked how similar this situation was to another situation that occurred in 1948. That incident involved a man named Lawrence Duggan, who was a high-level government official that was suspected of espionage. He had died by falling out of the window of his New York City office. Frank Olson went from having a long, fruitful career working for the government to being dead in a matter of months. All of this transpired shortly after he began expressing how guilty he felt for all of the things he witnessed and helped the government do. The official cause of death was that Frank jumped out the window himself. Now, I'm not accusing the government of doing anything, but it's important to note that the CIA's first manual on assassination states, quote, "The most efficient accident in simple assassination is a fall of 75 feet or more onto a hard surface," end quote. I think that says a lot. Also, in 1994, a second autopsy on Frank's body revealed that Frank had a large hematoma on the left side of his head and a large wound on his chest. Most of the team performing this autopsy agreed that these wounds had occurred before Frank fell out the window. James Starr, who was the doctor who led the second autopsy, believed that this evidence was, quote, "rankly and starkly suggestive of homicide," end quote. Frank Olson's family was never told that he had been drugged with LSD at that MK Ultra retreat, so they honestly had no clue what was wrong with Frank when he came back from the retreat, and they certainly had no clue why he could have potentially jumped out of the window. They wouldn't become aware of what happened at that MK Ultra retreat until the church committee exposed all of this 22 years later in 1975. Once the church committee let the cat out the bag, President Ford's administration immediately went into damage control mode. It was clear that the public finding out about all of the CIA's secret operations on American citizens would cause the public to intensely distrust the government. Even worse, it would cause the American public to begin asking questions about what else the CIA had been doing behind their backs. So, what should the American government do in a situation like this? Do they admit their faults and put forth considerable effort to ensure that something like this never happens again? Do they punish the CIA for violating the same citizens they were supposed to be protecting? Of course not. This is the American government. The game plan is always to deny as much as you can, downplay what can't be denied, and attempt to gaslight the fuck out of the public in order to maintain control. And that's exactly what the White House would do in this situation. Following the church committee's revelations, Chief of Staff Donald Rumsfeld and Chief Assistant Dick Cheney held several meetings with CIA General Counsel Lawrence Houston in June of 1975. Lawrence Houston made it emphatically clear that if too much information got out, specifically information concerning Project Artichoke, then major legal, international, and public relations issues would spring up. Issues that would most likely lead to the complete destruction of the CIA. But Lawrence Houston had a plan, a sneaky, crafty little plan that could prevent the worst information from ever seeing the light of day. Houston suggested that the government purposefully shift attention away from Project Artichoke by putting the spotlight on MK Ultra instead. Now, you might be wondering, what's the difference? They were both awful projects that experimented on American citizens. Well, the difference is MK Ultra was primarily a research-based project, where the CIA contracted out a large portion of the experiments to various universities and other institutions. Like I said, around 153 institutions were funded by the CIA to perform experiments and do research on behalf of MKUltra. The academic nature of MKUltra was nowhere near as insidious and problematic as the hardcore kidnapping, torture, and drugging of Project Artichoke. And as an added bonus, the CIA could just shift some of the blame to these institutions and make it seem like the CIA never authorized some of the horrific experiments that took place, as if they had no idea this stuff was going on. Lawrence Houston believed that if the CIA offered plenty of sordid, juicy details about MKUltra, then this would satisfy the media and the public's thirst for more information about secret CIA brainwashing programs. Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney were generally convinced that this would work, but they were still worried that releasing this sort of information will result in criminal prosecutions of CIA officials for crimes like kidnapping, drug trafficking, murder, just regular governmental agency stuff. But Lawrence Houston was way ahead of them because he had already negotiated a deal with the U.S. Department of Justice where, in the event that information about programs like MKUltra were ever revealed to the public, the Department of Justice would not prosecute CIA officials. In fact, he had negotiated this deal way back in February of 1954 with Deputy Attorney General William Rogers. Now, why would the CIA proactively negotiate this deal decades in advance? You gotta keep in mind, the Church Committee was in 75, right? And the CIA negotiated this deal with the Department of Justice in 1954. Why in 1954? Well, I personally don't believe it was any coincidence that Frank Olson had mysteriously fell from a window just 3 months prior. It's almost like the CIA knew that situation in particular had the potential to cause a major shitstorm for the agency. But that's just me. What do y'all think? Let me know down in the comments. This plan, cooked up by CIA attorney Lawrence Houston, Donald Rumsfeld, and Dick Cheney, would be codenamed Operation Dormouse. And in my opinion, this operation was an absolute success. Most people have never heard of Project Artichoke or even Project Bluebird, but you've heard a whole lot about MKUltra, haven't you? There's been plenty of movies and books and shows made about it. Information regarding MKUltra is all over the internet. Go look up the Project Bluebird and Artichoke Wikipedia page. Go ahead, I'll wait. Now go look up the MKUltra Wikipedia page. The amount of information between them is like night and day, and that was by design. Most of the time Project Artichoke is even mentioned, it's presented as if it's some small, insignificant project that fizzled out and morphed into the much more important MKUltra, when in reality, Artichoke continued to operate independently all the way into the 70s. The CIA and the White House chose to gaslight all of us into believing that MKUltra was the end-all be-all of CIA brainwashing experiments, when in reality, it was the least controversial, safest one out of all of them. If this video shocked or surprised you, imagine all of the information that's just flat out unavailable to the public. That's spooky. And with that brings us to the conclusion of this video. The reason I wanted to make this video is because being aware of potential brainwashing and governmental misconduct is more important now than perhaps ever before. Between social media bots, AI videos, and the deliberate spreading of misinformation, it is absolutely crucial to remain alert when it comes to someone or something attempting to carefully manipulate your thoughts and opinions. And it's not like the government ever stopped doing what it was doing during the Cold War. The CIA and the military continue to operate various facilities and black sites like Guantanamo Bay, doing God knows what to prisoners in order to obtain information. In 2003, just 22 years ago, the CIA, the RAND Corporation, and the American Psychological Association held several workshops where the use of truth drugs were suggested, as well as the use of sensory overload. That's the same rhetoric they were using back in the 60s. So just because you don't hear about it doesn't mean it's no longer happening. The average citizen wasn't aware of Project Bluebird, Artichoke, or MK Ultra back in the 50s and 60s. And the CIA learned from those situations, so there's no doubt they're a million times more effective at avoiding public detection in the modern era. It's important to hold our government accountable for their actions and not allow them to fearmonger their way into violating citizens. They used the fear of communism back during the Cold War. I don't think I need to list all of the things they use today to keep us afraid. I mean, it's everywhere. But thank you so much for watching this video. Again, please like and subscribe if you dig the content. It's only going to keep coming. It's only going to get better. And the supportive comments motivate me to keep grinding. And even the negative comments motivate me as well. So if you hated this video for whatever reason, leave a comment. Let me know. I'll argue with you in the comments because I got receipts for everything in this video. Anyway, I'm a stone-faced ape, and I'll see you all in the next video. Goodbye.